The nuclear bombs that their F-35A fighter jets have been designed for, they're being kind of pushed as what they call tactical nuclear weapons or battlefield nuclear weapons. And they talk about, these are nuclear weapons that are really small. And so they can be used on the battlefield. And, they're not the same as like these big nuclear weapons that Britain has in its sort of submarines. But the reality is, like, these nuclear bombs can have different yields of destructive power. So some of them can be smaller than the Hiroshima bomb and kill about 4,000 people, whereas the biggest size, they could probably kill about 600,000 people.
Hello and welcome to Global Majority for Peace podcast. I'm Ileana Chan, and every week on this podcast, we discuss with special guests from across the world our mission of building a global movement to promote peace and challenge the US-led war drive against China, Russia, and countries in the global south. We will be posting the first 30 minutes here on YouTube and then the full episode on Patreon on Thursday. And then Saturday, you get the audio on Patreon as well as a transcript and the audios on Spotify and Amazon Music. So please help us by becoming members of our Patreon today. Today, we are so happy to introduce our guest to Global Majority for Peace podcast, Sophie Bolt. Sophie is General Secretary of CND, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament UK. Sophie has over 30 years campaigning experience and has been part of CND's leadership for over 20 years. That's an amazing resume, and I'm so happy that you're on this show and, to give me some insight into everything that's going on. But before we get into it, we like to start interviews on a personal note to get a sense of who you are and how you came to your particular worldview.
Yeah. I mean, how did I get politicized? I suppose is the question, isn't it? So for me, it was going to university, and I went as a mature student, and I had a lot of kind of soul searching in terms of, can I afford to go to university? And at that time, I mean, you were going to come out with £5,000 worth of debt. And you think about the levels of debt now, it's just huge, isn't it? But for me, at that time, I was like, can I justify getting into that amount of debt to go to university? And I decided that, I did. It was really important where I was going in the world, to myself, in terms of my development, values, all that sort of stuff. So I did. And it was kind of life-changing, really. It was absolutely amazing to be around people who had very clearly worked out political views, people who were still finding their way and getting involved in campaigning and sort of being able to kind of make a difference, getting involved in student politics where there were kind of democratic structures where you could kind of go along and say, I think we should do this thing, and then you could go away and do it. And so from that, I kind of got very involved in campaigning for free education and against, the big attacks that were taking place literally just as I went to university, with the introduction of tuition fees and the abolition of the grant. So for me, this was so personal, having had such a big issue about, can I afford to go to university? I wanted other people to have this very, very important experience. So that was kind of really my kind of way into becoming kind of political. I sort of saw it to begin with as a sort of issue around kind of economic justice, but very quickly that kind of developed into sort of social justice and then international justice. You sort of make all those links, don't you? So it was just a matter of time before I kind of got involved in international politics and the kind of anti-war and peace movement.
Yeah, so talking about international politics and the anti-war peace movement, we've just had the NATO summit, which was held in The Hague at the end of June. One of the main issues on the table was the requested military increase to 5%, which NATO chief Mark Rutte was quite confident he could achieve. He has since called Trump daddy and other shenanigans like that, but CND UK has a clear no to NATO stance. Can you explain how dangerous these current escalations are?
Well, we all know how dangerous they are, don't we? We've just sort of seen in November last year, we had a situation over the Ukraine crisis where there was a real threat that nuclear weapons are going to be used, massively dangerous situation. And from CND's point, we sort of oppose Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but we also recognise that the huge aggressive expansion of NATO has been absolutely central in terms of destabilising the region and destabilizing the situation in Ukraine. And certainly the role of the US and Britain in that conflict has been incredibly dangerous. I mean, it was the really reckless decision by Biden and also by Starmer to agree to Ukraine using their long range missiles, despite the fact that Russia had changed its nuclear use policy to say, we will consider using our nuclear weapons if these type of long-range missiles are fired into our territory. And nonetheless, they went ahead and agreed for Ukraine to use those missiles. And you then had this very, very dangerous situation where you had kind of ballistic long-range missiles firing across Ukraine and Russia. And, I think all of us were really, really sort of terrified that we were potentially going towards nuclear confrontation. And why? Why was this escalation taking place? It was because sort of Biden and Starmer were trying to sort of see if they could get any kind of greater geographical sort of gain for Ukraine in that conflict. But military experts were saying that those type of weaponry, those sort of missiles were not going to have any kind of really sort of significant impact in that conflict. Biden knew that, Starmer knew that. So it was actually about something else. You know what I mean? It was about sort of escalating the situation for Biden to come out of that conflict either strengthened or not in a situation where Ukraine had collapsed kind of militarily. But I think certainly from the British point of view, it was to show that Britain was this really strong military leadership in Europe, incredibly reckless. And at a time when the Ukrainian people had sort of made it clear they didn't want this war to be continuing. They wanted a very sort of quick conclusion. So I think that's the kind of background to why NATO is so dangerous. And now we have a situation where Mark Rutte, and obviously led, as you say, by Donald Trump, this is really about making Europe pay for Trump's global wars. It's been sort of presented by figures across Europe, particularly in sort of Germany and France, that this is about having a kind of independent militarism from the US and from NATO, but it's complete opposite. This is just sort of posturing to national countries. And like, Mark Rutte has said this himself, this is about Europe coordinating with the US so the US can kind of repivot to the Asia Pacific and, to have this very, very dangerous global confrontation with China, which would be an absolute catastrophe. So that's really what's going on. And this whole drive to the 5% of GDP for military spending, it's not about confronting Russia. Russia's economy is much, much, much smaller than a lot of European countries. It's not about that. It's totally about Trump's global war. So yeah, incredibly dangerous situation. And I think the wild rhetoric that we've seen, particularly from the British government, saying that, Russia is like an immediate threat, sort of facing sort of invasion, this kind of thing, but also threatening Russia with how Britain's nuclear submarine, just one nuclear submarine, can incinerate 40 Russian cities. This kind of language is impacting the international situation. It's massively escalating these tensions at a time when we need to be doing the opposite. We need to be de-escalating. So I think as well as this big rise in military spending, it's also the sort of the rhetoric that's kind of going with it to justify these huge levels of spending.
Yeah, I've been really maybe naively surprised about this ramping up of the Russia will invade, you better learn Russia narrative that is coming out just recently. I mean, I'm just surprised because they're regurgitating something that I thought had subsided over the past few years. They're certainly doing it, and Keir Starmer at the summit announced that Britain will purchase at least a dozen new F-35A fighter jets, which reintroduces a nuclear role for the Royal Air Force for the first time since the Cold War, although some would say that the Cold War perhaps hasn't really ended ever. But can you expand on the implications of this? And in your assessment, is Starmer's subservient posture in regards to US foreign policy an escalation from previous governments? It feels to me like there might be an escalation, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
It totally is an escalation. I mean, basically Britain is massively increasing its nuclear capability. It currently has 4 nuclear submarines that are supposed to be on patrol continuously. And so that's one delivery system for its nuclear weapons from the water, from the sea. Then this is all about it having a whole new delivery system from the air. And I think what's particularly dangerous about this is the fact that the nuclear bombs that their F-35A fighter jets have been designed for, they're being kind of pushed as what they call tactical nuclear weapons or battlefield nuclear weapons. And they talk about, these are nuclear weapons that are really small. And so they can be used on the battlefield. And, they're not the same as like these big nuclear weapons that Britain has in its sort of submarines. But the reality is, like, these nuclear bombs can have different yields of destructive power. So some of them can be smaller than the Hiroshima bomb and kill about 4,000 people, whereas the biggest size, they could probably kill about 600,000 people. So this idea that they are small and therefore they can be used on the battlefield is really, really terrifying and very, very dangerous. And this sort of trying to soften public opinion to the use of nuclear weapons has been going on for a long time now. This isn't a new thing, but we're now kind of getting to a point where I think it's becoming a lot more of a sort of a serious threat that they will be used. So you've got Britain massively escalating its nuclear capability in a situation where we know that US nuclear bombs, these tactical nuclear bombs, are being delivered to NATO bases across Europe already. Then on top of that, Macron is saying, oh, we're very happy to share our nuclear capable jets and they can be deployed across Europe. We know that Poland is very keen to have these French jets. So you could have a situation where you have nuclear capable jets in Poland right on Russia's border. So it's about massively increasing the nuclear presence across Europe, but also these fighter jets, it means that Britain would be literally kind of participating in any kind of potentially sort of a land war that involves nuclear weapons. So it's very, very serious. It has sort of huge implications, but also in terms of the subordination of Britain's nuclear weapons and Britain's nuclear policy, military policy to the US. This sort of so-called special relationship has been in place for decades. There's something called the Mutual Defence Agreement, which is literally, it's enshrined in British law that Britain, can sort of share bases with the US and it has no say over what happens to those bases. But it also means that Britain has agreed to subordinate its nuclear weapons under NATO command. So that really means that NATO is deciding where those nuclear weapons are deployed, how those nuclear weapons are targeted and where they're targeted. So the idea that this is some kind of independent system is just not true. But it has been kind of causing a lot of kind of contradictory situations in Britain, because on the one hand you have sections of the political establishment that are very concerned that Trump's not a safe pair of hands anymore, because he was sort of attempting to kind of bring about a settlement in relation to Ukraine. So there's sort of been fears that, could Donald Trump turn off the nuclear tap? Because Britain's nuclear submarines, the missiles for those submarines are launched from are leased from the US. So there's a sort of fear that, Trump could just say, oh, no, you can't have those missiles anymore. I mean, there's no evidence at all to suggest that that's going to happen. But I think this is what's been part of the sort of frenzy, the kind of rhetoric around, why Britain has to sort of have, even more nuclear weapons. But whatever, those nuclear weapons are still going to be under US command. The nuclear bombs, in those jets, they are owned by the US. They are US bombs. So there's sort of reports that obviously the US would be deciding when and where those bombs would be dropped. So I think it's again very much about this whole thing of Britain paying Trump for this kind of global war drive. And they are British, they're going to be British nuclear jets, but they're going to be completely integrated into NATO and US foreign policy.
That's really fascinating the way that they have moved the conversation so that Trump being possibly for peace becomes the threat against us. And I suppose it just like primes the general public to always welcome US aggression. I suppose that is their overall intention. But another area of very obvious volatile escalation is Israel's unprovoked attack on Iran. Now, despite substantial evidence to the contrary, Trump and Starmer both described this as a preemptive strike to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons. And this was further escalated by a direct US attack on three Iranian nuclear sites. Keir Starmer consequently doubled down on this hawkish defense, stating on X, Iran's nuclear program is a grave threat to international security. Iran can never be allowed to develop a nuclear weapon, and the US has taken action to alleviate that threat. Can you help us unpack the warmongering propaganda playbook that is being used here?
Well, first of all, I mean, you just have to start with the obscene nuclear hypocrisy around all of this. The fact that Israel has nuclear weapons, we think over 90 nuclear weapons. It totally refuses to acknowledge that it has them. It totally refuses to sign up to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is like the kind of the cornerstone of international sort of disarmament frameworks. And it completely refuses to have any inspections by the International Atomic Energy Agency. So then you have a situation where Iran has signed up to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, has been allowing inspectors in to inspect its nuclear facilities for decades now. And in fact, signed up to an international framework that was very carefully put together by UN Security Council members in 2015, which was about finding a peaceful kind of diplomatic way to move out of this sort of confrontational sort of crisis sort of situation where Iran was sort of viewed as being this kind of nuclear threat. And the main sort of points of that agreement was that Iran would agree to have much more sort of intensive inspections. You know, the whole fear was, or the way it was presented was, Iran is trying to develop nuclear weapons, so therefore we have to have these inspections to make sure that's not happening. So Iran totally signed up to those very intensive inspections. It also reduced its stockpile of enriched uranium. This whole thing about enriched uranium is that if you enrich uranium to 90%, then that means it's weapons grade. So that's when you could kind of make a nuclear bomb. So Iran completely reduced its stockpile. It reduced the sort of the percentage that it was enriching uranium. And it basically completely sort of did what it was told, basically. And the International Atomic Energy Authority, you know, also agreed that it kind of met all the criteria within the JCPOA, as it's called. The other side of the bargain was for the US to lift crippling sanctions that it had placed on Iran. So this was a kind of motivating factor for Iran, understandably. You know, these sanctions have been having a really horrific impact on the population, a real kind of collective punishment of the Iranian people because the US doesn't support the Iranian regime. So that was the kind of the agreement. So Iran had come up with its side of the agreement, and that's when Trump just walked away from that treaty, kind of trashed it, and would not basically said would not agree to lifting sanctions, and instead he intensified those sanctions. And also something that's important to understand is the role of Israel in all of this, because when Biden was elected, so this is after Trump has sort of trashed the treaty, so Biden was elected, Biden restarted the talks around the nuclear deal. And we know that there's very widespread evidence that Israel carried out a cyber attack on Iran's Natanz nuclear facilities in order to sabotage those talks. So I think, sort of generally the view is, when you look at that kind of evidence, is that actually the US and Israel were not really bothered or interested in reaching a kind of peaceful solution with Iran, where they would feel confident that Iran was not going to develop nuclear weapons. It had evidence that Iran was not developing nuclear weapons, and it completely sabotaged these talks. Now you come to now, with Israel bombing the nuclear facilities, followed by the horrific bombardment by the US. They both had overwhelming evidence that Iran was not developing nuclear weapons, both from the International Atomic Energy Agency and also from the US intelligence. They knew that Iran was not developing nuclear weapons. So this was really about wanting to sort of bring about a regime change in Iran and to sort of devastate the country and to weaken it. And I think CND is incredibly concerned about this kind of direction, because this is sort of completely breaches international law. Both Israel and the US completely breaches international law. It breaches the UN Charter, and it breaches the statute of the International Atomic Energy Agency. So it's this whole, idea that there's a rules-based order which has to be imposed by the US on some countries, but it doesn't have to abide by those rules. And obviously Israel doesn't have to abide by those rules either. And certainly from CND's point of view, we feel that what that exposes is this massive nuclear hypocrisy. As I say, on the one hand, Israel can have nuclear weapons and, no sanctions on Israel, but Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons and, has sanctions and is bombed. But I think also it shows the kind of the wider nuclear hypocrisy, where you have just all the sort of the nuclear weapon states, particularly those that are signed up to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, have an obligation. They've signed this treaty and they have an obligation to disarm their nuclear weapons. And they're not doing that. The opposite is happening. You know what I mean? Like with Britain, they are massively increasing their nuclear arsenals, they're modernizing them. And also, they are justifying the use of their own nuclear weapons. Like, this is British nuclear use policy. It justifies using its nuclear weapons against countries that don't have nuclear weapons, that have signed up to the NPT, but they view are breaching their obligations, i.e. a country like Iran. They view that they are justified in using their nuclear weapons against such a country. So this is really, really sort of horrific level of nuclear hypocrisy, but also it doesn't work. I mean, if this is really about trying to stop countries from getting nuclear weapons, really it's doing the opposite, isn't it? Our concern is, already we know that Iran's parliament has got a bill now to consider whether it's going to withdraw from the NPT. And our view is this kind of military aggression against countries to try and, encourage them to not get nuclear weapons. Our concern is that it's actually going to push them towards getting nuclear weapons, especially when they are facing the threat of a nuclear attack. So on all levels, it's an absolute sort of disaster, and our view is that the only way that you can bring about proper sort of disarmament is through peace, diplomacy, and international frameworks that everybody has signed up to. And we think what's absolutely urgent at this time is there's a treaty for a nuclear weapons-free Middle East, which Britain, is a key sponsor of this UN resolution. That needs to be implemented. If you want to get rid of nuclear weapons in the Middle East, then you've got to bring Israel into that equation. So that's absolutely critical, and that's kind of what we're calling for now. I mean, obviously, we really, really hope that the ceasefire holds. That's absolutely critical. But these kind of wider issues around disarmament, but also international law and abiding by international law are critical.
Yeah, I mean, to expand a little bit further on that, the expressed purpose of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament from your website states CND opposes all nuclear and other weapons of mass destruction, the development, manufacture, testing, deployment, and use or threatened use by any country. And as you've kind of discussed already, I mean, you have actually discussed, but to sort of put it in plainer terms, there's an inherent contradiction that if a country like Iran that does not have nuclear weapons can be invaded because of supposed development. I mean, but the reality is, if they had nuclear weapons, I think prevailing sort of common sense would be they probably wouldn't have been invaded, right? So, I mean, generally, so this is the issue. Like, how in good conscience can we be like disarm in the face of such threat?
Yeah, yeah, totally. No, as I say, it's like this massive sort of nuclear hypocrisy. And also, Britain argues that it has a fundamental right. Nuclear weapons are absolutely fundamental to its security. That's what it says. So if that's the case, and you use that logic, then that means every country should have nuclear weapons, including Iran. And then, you would have like hundreds of countries all with nuclear weapons. And obviously that would be absolutely disastrous, and you would only massively increase the threat of nuclear weapons being used. So you have to move away from that. You have to move to a different type of framework about what is security, what brings security to countries and to people, and it's not nuclear weapons. We very much endorse a kind of, it's called the sort of the common security approach, which is you need to look at the security interests and concerns of all countries in a region, and you can't just sort of place your own security above every other country. That just can't work. You have to have this kind of mutual approach to bringing about sort of security for all countries. That's the way that you do that, and that has to be done through talks, discussions, diplomacy. That's the way you do it. But ultimately, these nuclear weapons, they are so powerful now that they can destroy the world. So it's not like it's just going to be some little isolated sort of incident in a country. It impacts the entire world and our entire population, and it can bring about our our destruction. And in fact, we know that certainly since the Ukraine war, that people now feel that what's the biggest threat in terms of bringing about the end of the world is nuclear war. So people totally get how dangerous the situation is. And we're certainly finding that just with the announcement of this increase in military spending, the announcement of these new nuclear jets, we're getting lots more members joining because they are really frightened and also really angry, absolutely furious that we have leaders that are behaving in this totally reckless way. No regard for the real security concerns that we face, completely reneging on their responsibilities around climate action, and poverty is going up. And with that, we're seeing a whole other range of very serious political issues like the rise of the far right, massive rise in racism. And that is a vicious circle, isn't it? Where racism is always used as ways to sort of justify wars and to other people. We've seen that with the Iraq war. We're seeing it again in relation to China, huge increases in xenophobia and attacks on Southeast Asian people. So, as I say, this whole rhetoric is very, very dangerous. So we have to move away from that. We have to move towards a situation where we recognize that if we are going to have any future, we have to cooperate globally and in a peaceful way. I mean, we have to do that if we really want to tackle climate change and halt climate breakdown. We have to do that collaboratively and, in cooperation with other countries. And that's the real security issue that we face, isn't it? That and huge levels of poverty. That's what we should be tackling. And I think because the stakes are so high now, I think because the kind of gloves are off now with Trump. I think previously under the sort of Biden administration and before that, it was always kind of hidden the sort of the self-interest, the sort of the venal kind of self-interest, brutal self-interest around democracy or, human rights and stuff. Whereas now Trump just kind of says it as it is. And I think more and more people are realizing how dangerous this kind of world that's kind of dominated by sort of US militarism is, and want an alternative, and rightly so.
Thank you for watching the first part of our interview. Please head over to patreon.com/Empire Watch to watch the full episode. The podcast is also available as an audio on Spotify and Amazon Music every Saturday.